Torchbearers of History, a connected series of historical sketches by Amelia Hutchinson Stirling. Chapter 9. Columbus, the Discovery of the New World. Only 5 years after Joan of Arc was burned at Rouen, through the ignorant superstition of the English, there was born a man who did much to enlighten men's ignorance and to widen their minds. That man was Christopher Columbus, the discoverer of America. For centuries, men had gone on living in the belief they knew the world they lived in, and that the world they knew of was all. You can fancy their amazement when the news burst upon them that far away in the west there lay another world, as vast as that already known to them. You can fancy how ignorant it must have made them feel to think that the great world had been lying there all these centuries, while they knew nothing of it. Not the Greeks, with all their learning, not the Romans, who boasted that their empire stretched over the world, had ever dreamt of the world of the West, of America. The Greeks and the Romans, indeed, with all their learning and skill and power, had but vague notions of geography. Alexander the Great, by his conquests in Asia, did a great deal to make men know more about other countries beside their own. But it was not till after the time of Columbus that the true nature of the earth of ours, and the position of the different continents upon it, were clearly understood. Even before Columbus was born, the people of Europe had begun to take more interest than they used to do in the discovery of new lands by sea. I have told you how it is said those wild sea-roving Northmen had reached the shores of America centuries before the time of Columbus. But if they had, the other people of Europe had no history of their discovery. At most, there was only some vague story that land had been reached westwards by some North Sea rovers. Early in the 15th century, the century of Joan of Arc and of Columbus, the people of Portugal, which, as you will see from your map, is the western part of the most westerly peninsula of Europe, had begun to show a spirit of enterprise and discovery. Expeditions were sent out by them to endeavour to find a passage by the south of Africa to India, and they discovered the island of Madeira and the Azores, and settled on the west coast of Africa. No doubt stories of what the Portuguese had done and were doing reached the ears of the boy Columbus, and helped to stir up the spirit of inquiry and discovery that was born in him. His father was a well-to-do citizen of Genoa, a town in the north of Italy, where he carried on the trade of a wool-comber, and where his great son Christopher was born in 1436. Christopher was taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and drawing as a boy, and he soon showed a keen interest in geography and a burning desire to go to sea. His father, understanding this, sent him to the University of Pavia, where he was taught geometry, astronomy, and navigation. But he was not long at the university. He was little more than a boy when he was sent to sea, on which he passed the following years of his life, taking part in many an expedition and many a small sea fight. Life at sea in those days was a very different thing from what it is now. Men had not learned either to make or to manage ships as they do in our days, and they could not venture out on the wide ocean with their imperfect vessels and their ignorance of navigation. They looked upon the broad Atlantic that stretched away to the west from the shores of Spain and Portugal with a kind of superstitious awe, and no mariner would have thought of launching himself upon what appeared an endless stretch of water. The Portuguese, indeed, had lately sailed the Atlantic, but they had not attempted to cross it, only to coast Africa with the hope of finding, to the south of that continent, a passage by which means they could reach India. The ships of those days generally confined themselves to the narrow seas, the Mediterranean, the North Sea, etc. In these seas, fights would often take place between vessels belonging to different countries, or even to different noblemen, who often fitted out small fleets to attack by sea some land of which they wanted to take possession, or to which they lay claim. Columbus took part in several expeditions of this sort, and in particular he frequently attacked the vessels of the Turks, which at the time it was considered almost a pious thing to do, just as it was to take part in a crusade. In a fight with some Venetian ships off the coast of Portugal, not far from Lisbon, his vessel was set on fire, and Columbus and his crew leapt into the sea. Columbus, laying hold of an oar, by the help of which, as he was a good swimmer, he managed to make his way to land. It was in 1470 that Columbus, then a man of about 34, went to Portugal, to which many men of learning or of adventurous spirit were at the time drawn by the stories of the discoveries made by the people. In Lisbon, Columbus married the niece of one of the most distinguished of the Portuguese navigators, who had died not long before. Most probably his wife brought with her to her new home many tales of adventure, and seeing that her husband was much interested in all that concerned discoveries by sea, she would often relate them to him, and thus perhaps she gave him fresh stimulus. Meanwhile, Columbus pored over every map and chart and writing of any sort connected with the geography and navigation that he could lay his hands on. Sometimes he went expeditions with the Portuguese to Africa. At other times, he supported his family by making maps and plans. Meantime, his great project had arisen in his mind, and he was steadily growing in strength to sail out westwards over the apparently endless stretch of the Atlantic, with the hope of reaching land. It was in the year 1474, 4 years after coming to Lisbon, that, so far as we know, he first told anyone of his project, and of the reasons which had led him to think of it. Curiously enough, though Columbus succeeded in carrying out one of the greatest discoveries that has ever been made, his faith that he should succeed was based upon a blunder. He believed that the earth was round, as we know it to be, and that consequently it was possible to sail round it, but he believed that it was very much smaller than it actually is, and the land he expected to reach by sailing westwards was not an unknown continent, but the continent of Asia, which he thought stretched much further eastwards than it does. That there was land to the west of the Atlantic he felt sure from all he had heard. He had learned that trunks of trees had been washed up on the shores of the Azores, which were unlike any that grew there, and that pieces of wood had been picked up in the Atlantic, which were evidently carved with human hands, but not with iron tools. When he had reached his conclusion that Asia could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic, the idea became fixed in his mind, and he became filled with a solemn, almost religious belief that he was appointed by Providence to make the voyage of discovery, just as Joan of Arc had believed that it was her divine mission to place the crown of France on the head of the Dauphin. But it was impossible to carry out, or even to attempt, such a project as Columbus dreamed of without money to get ships and men and provisions. Columbus applied to the King of Portugal, who, however, refused to fit out an expedition for him. I am ashamed to tell you that the king was contemptible enough to permit a ship to be privately sent off on the route which Columbus had laid down. That ship, however, never got very far. The pilots took fright when they saw the boundless waters of the Atlantic stretching before them, and returned to Lisbon. Columbus, indignant at this base cunning, immediately left Portugal, taking with him his son, who was still a boy. His wife had been dead some time. From Portugal he went to Spain, in order to seek help from King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who at that time ruled over Christian Spain. The Moors, against whom the Cid had fought 4 centuries before, were still reigning in the south part of the country, which was called Granada. When Columbus arrived in Spain, all the country was taken up with a great war which was going on between the Christian monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, and the Moorish king of Granada, and Columbus found it almost impossible to get anyone to listen to his scheme. He waited from week to week, from month to month, in poverty and suspense, always hoping to get an audience with the king and queen, and to be told that they were willing to grant him what he wanted. But the Great War entirely took up the thoughts of the monarchs, and they had no attention to spare for the future discoverer of America. It was not till 7 years after his coming to Spain, not till he had followed the court about from place to place in the march against the Moors, even taking part himself in the war and distinguishing himself by his courage. Not till he had endured great poverty, the ridicule of his fellow men, and almost every form of hardship, not till then did he at last obtain fulfillment of his hopes. In the end of the year 1491, he was summoned to the presence of Queen Isabella, who was at the time in the camp of the Christian army before the walls of Granada, the capital of the Moorish king of Spain. Columbus was to witness the defeat of the Moors in 1492. He saw all the glitter and splendor of the Spanish army spread out before him, and he heard the shouts of triumph and the hymns of thanksgiving that rose to the skies as the last of the Moorish kings came forth from his magnificent palace of the Alhambra and delivered up its keys to Ferdinand and Isabella. It was certainly the proudest moment in the history of Spain. Thenceforth the country was a Christian kingdom, ruled by Christian monarchs. It is interesting to think of Columbus being present on that great occasion. Columbus, who was himself so soon to place another jewel in the crown of Spain. At last, after his long years of waiting and suing, after all his hopes and fears and anxieties, Columbus, then a man of 56, obtained the wish of his life. He set sail on the 3rd of August, 1492, with a small fleet of 3 vessels, of which, after some opposition, he had been named admiral. In his interview with Queen Isabella at Granada, he succeeded in arousing her interest in his proposed discovery, and she declared that she was ready to pledge her jewels to raise the necessary money, even though the king was unfavorable to the expedition. Even after the consent of both monarchs had been obtained, it was long before the sailors could be got to go on board the vessels. They looked upon the proposal to sail across the Atlantic with a kind of superstitious horror. When at last Columbus had succeeded in getting crews for his 3 vessels, when they had put out into the open sea, when the last speck of land had vanished from their longing backwards gaze, and only the wide waters of the mysterious unknown ocean stretched before and behind them as far as the eye could see, then the men burst into tears as they thought of the country they had left behind them, and the homes and the friends they believed they should never see again. It was on the 8th of October, more than 2 months after the little fleet had set out from Spain, that land was first sighted. During these 2 months, the anxieties and the trouble which Columbus had to bear must have been terrible, as day after day and week after week passed by, and still there was no sight of land. The discontent of the crew increased to almost open mutiny and rebellion against their admiral, and there were even whispered amongst the men proposals to put him quietly out of the way, and then turn back. Columbus knew all this, but he never for a moment wavered in his course. His faith in his own destiny never left him. In the management of the men he showed firmness, kindness, and tact, doing everything in his power to awaken their interest and faith in the strange land to which he was leading them, and offering a large reward to the man who should first see land. At first this offer had but little effect, for the men did not believe that they should ever see land at all. But by and by signs that land were not very far away began to reach them, Little birds came singing about the ship, and a branch of thorn with red berries on it, as well as various weeds, was seen floating towards the vessel. Then, from being rebellious and dejected, the men became eager and excited. They kept a bright lookout, and many were the false alarms of land ahead. On the evening of October the 7th, when the sailors had sung their vesper hymn, Columbus spoke to them very earnestly and solemnly of the goodness of God in having brought them in safety so far, and having granted them fair weather. Then he told them that he believed they should that night reach land. Not many hours after, about 10 o'clock, as he was eagerly scanning the darkness before him, he saw a light in the distance, which seemed to move about, to appear and disappear again, as if carried by someone along the shore. He called 2 men and bade them look, and both declared that they saw the light. Then, though no one else thought anything of it, Columbus believed that they had reached land, and that the land was inhabited. At 2 in the morning, a gun from one of the other ships proved that he was right. Land had been seen. Can you imagine the wild excitement of the sailors, the deep, intense eagerness, the awed solemnity, and the pious thankfulness of their admiral, as they waited with furled sails for the morning light? When the sun rose on the 8th of October, there stretched before the eager eyes of Columbus and his men a beautiful island, covered with verdure and trees. It was one of the Bahama Islands, which we now know situated off the east coast of Central America. But Columbus did not know of the existence of America, and he believed that the island lay off the east of Asia. I cannot attempt to describe to you the feelings of the great discoverer when he first set foot on that new found land. As soon as he landed, he threw himself on his knees and kissed the sand, thanking God for his kindness and permitting him to reach this unknown country. He then unfurled the Spanish flag and took possession of the island in the names of Ferdinand and Isabella. Meantime, a group of the natives had gathered on the shore and were gazing with awestruck wonder at the ships and at the new arrivals with their strange clothes and weapons. In their ignorance and simplicity, they believed that Columbus and his followers were gods who had dropped from the skies. They were an innocent, harmless race of people who treated the Spaniards with confidence and kindness. After discovering several other islands, amongst them the island of Haiti, or Hispaniola, as Columbus called it, he returned homewards in order to report to the King and Queen of Spain his wonderful discovery. On the voyage they experienced a terrible storm, and almost despaired of ever seeing land again. But at last they arrived safely in Spain on the 15th of March, 1493, not much more than 7 months after they had started. Very different was the reception of Columbus now from what it had been when he first arrived in Spain, an unknown stranger. Church bells were rung, shops were closed, people rushed in crowds to welcome the return of the discoverers. The journey of Columbus from the Palos, where he landed, to Barcelona, where the king and queen were at the time, was like a royal progress. 6 months later, he started again for the new-found country, with a fleet of 17 vessels, filled with men eager for the gold and riches which they believed that the country contained. On Columbus himself every honor had been conferred, and as he sailed away from Cadiz, Admiral of Spain and Viceroy of the newly discovered land, no one would ever have imagined that in a few years he was to return a prisoner loaded with chains. Yet so it was. In Hispaniola, which Columbus fixed upon as the seat of his new colony, and where he built a town, complaints and discontent soon broke out amongst the settlers, when they had found that it was not possible to become wealthy in a moment by the discovery of piles of gold. Many of the more ambitious of the colonists, too, looked with envy and spite upon the viceroy, who was not a Spaniard like themselves. Gradually reports unfavorable to Columbus reached the ears of the king and queen, discontented colonists returned to Spain, spreading false stories of the cruelty and severity of the new viceroy, and accusing him of having made false statements to the king and queen as to the condition of the newly found country. At last the Spanish monarchs resolved to send a nobleman to Hispaniola to inquire into the conduct of Columbus and to take his place as viceroy. When the commissioner arrived in San Domingo, a fort which Columbus had built on the coast of Haiti, and which had now grown into a town, Columbus was absent on an exploring expedition. All sorts of reports and slanders against him were brought by the discontented settlers to the new arrival. Bobadilla, that was the name of the royal commissioner, believed, or pretended to believe them. He took possession of the house of Columbus, and all that was in it, and distributed his goods amongst the men to whom arrears of pay were owing. Then, having heard some rumours that Columbus intended to resist him, with the help of some native chiefs, as soon as the great discoverer returned from his expedition, he ordered him to be handcuffed and conveyed home to Spain. So in the year 1500, Columbus arrived in Spain, loaded with chains, and quite broken down with all that he had gone through, toil and hardship, anxiety and grief. On his arrival, he wrote a long letter to a friend at the court of the Queen, relating all that he had done and all he had suffered. When the letter was read by Queen Isabella, she was full of indignation, ordered that Columbus should at once be set free and brought into her presence, and it was said that when he appeared before her, and she read the story of his sufferings in his haggard face and sunken eyes, she shed tears of sorrow. Once more, in the year 1502, Columbus set out on a voyage to the west. The voyage was to be his last. This time his intention was to sail right round the world, reaching India from the west, and thence returning, laden with the riches of that country, made by the route which the Portuguese had discovered round the Cape of Good Hope. He expected to find a strait where the Isthmus of Darien is situated in Central America, which would lead from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. But the expedition proved a failure, and in 1504 he returned for the last time to Spain, utterly worn out with sickness and suffering and disappointment. The last 2 years of the life of the great discoverer are painful to think of. They were years of poverty and want and hopeless petitioning. The money which had been promised him had not all been paid to him, and he writes to his son at this time, "I do not own a roof in Spain. I have no resort but an inn, and for the most times have not wherewithal to pay my bill." Queen Isabella, who had always befriended him nobly, died only a few days after his return to Spain, and Ferdinand, who had never been his cordial friend, would have not listened to his request to be restored to his former position as governor of the new country. On the 20th of May, 1506, while he was still hoping to be restored to the favour of the king, he died peacefully, surrounded by a few faithful friends.